there, my name is Jasmine Sky, and if you missed my last video, I am at my mom's house in Florida, so that's why I have a very different background going on. But today I am going to be talking about all of my favorite books and all of my reading stats from 2021. I didn't completely track my reading stats last year, I only tracked my favorites, but I did have 16 favorites last year and 17 favorites this year, so that is really exciting. And this year I did track all of my reading stats because I think that is just a lot of fun. I read 51 books this year, which beat my goal of 50 books, so that's great. I did make graphs, so I'm gonna go through all of my reading stats first, and then we'll get to my favorites of the year. Let me step to the side so you can see all of my graphs. Now, I did make these graphs a couple days ago, and I managed to read several more books before I made these graphs, so when I made these graphs, I had only had 48 books read, and then I read 3 more books in this last week. So the graphs are a little off, but I think the percentages are pretty much accurate. Just for those of you who care about the numbers, this last week I read 1 more YA contemporary fantasy and 2 adult romance books, and they were all via ebook. So I did put timestamps in the description, so if you want to skip straight to my favorites, you can go ahead and do that. But if you're the type of person like me who enjoys some reading stats, then stick around for my graphs. We're going to go through them pretty fast because I don't want to spend forever talking about all of my stats, but I do want to show off my lovely graphs. So here we go. First off, we'll talk about the overall age categories of what I read this year. Of my books that I read, about 27% were YA, 65% were adult, and 8% were middle grade. We're gonna talk about this in a later video, but one of my goals for 2021 was to read more YA, and while this percentage I do think is a higher percentage of YA, even though I didn't track it, I think it's a higher percentage of YA than what I read in 2020. It's still not what I want, which is more like 50% YA, so that's a goal for next year, is to get this graph to have a larger chart of YA. But you know what? In terms of how I read them, 56% I read via ebook, and a lot of that is actually because many of them were ebook only, which I'll explain later. 33% were physical book, and 10% I read via audiobook. I was experimenting again with audiobooks this year. I don't tend to do well with audiobooks, but I did a lot of driving for work this year, so I tried to listen to audiobooks again, and some of them really worked out. Some of my favorites, 2 of my favorites actually, were via audiobook. And then to go back to what I was saying about ebooks, I will do this statistic, which is that 58% of the books I read were prose novels, and 42% were graphic novels, manhwa, manga, manhwa, all of those things. I read a lot, 42% of graphic novels, manhwa, that type of stuff, and most of those, especially the manhwa, all of those are ebook only. I read them on sites like Lezen, Tappytoon, these online portals where you can buy manga, manhwa, graphic novels, webcomics, all that sort of thing. So that's why a lot of my pie for the type of read, physical versus ebook or not, are ebook, because I as you can see, I read a lot of this 42%. I think I only read 2 physical graphic novels, and most of them were ebook, manhwa, etc. So that's also possibly what inflated my adult percentages as well, because most of the manhwa I read was adult, though some was YA, but we'll get into that later. In terms of genre, I will do the overarching category first. This is more kind of based on the setting. Fantasy, 50% of the books I read had magic involved in some way, shape, or form, or were set in kind of a secondary world medieval setting, even if there was no actual magic, but that's still considered fantasy. 44% were contemporary, as in they were set in some form of the real world, and 6% were science fiction, set either in a futuristic setting or in space or something like that, or superhero stories. I also consider those science fiction. So 50% fantasy, that definitely tracks. I definitely think I read more science fiction in 2020 than I did this last year. I wasn't really in the mood for sci-fi this year, but maybe next year it'll kind of come back. I go through moods when it comes to science fiction, but let's break down these even more. So my largest category in terms of smaller sort of subgenres was actually romance. And in here, when I say romance, I'm talking about adult romance. So I didn't count my YA romances. Those I just put in contemporary. But in terms of adult romance, I had, 23%? Which is the largest of any of these chunks. And then in generic fantasy, secondary world fantasy, 20% was my next biggest chunk. And then I had two 17%, approximately 17% contemporary fantasy and 17% just contemporary. Like I said, those were pretty much all of my YA contemporary, and then a couple adult contemporary that were not romance. And then the last chunk of fantasy is the portal fantasy stories, which are very big in the manhwa space, though I do have some portal fantasies on my most anticipated books of next year, especially in middle grade. So I just really like portal fantasies, and I'm excited to see that genre hopefully come back into the Western publishing sphere, because it's very popular in the East Asian publishing sphere. But anyway, 12% of my reads were portal fantasy, 6% were sci-fi. That's the same number from earlier. I didn't break it down anymore because I didn't have that many sci-fi reads. And 4% were thriller, which I don't expect to grow, and I kind of expect to lessen in future years, because honestly, I struggle with thriller, and the two thriller books that I read made me just feel not great. I just didn't enjoy the reading experience. So yeah, but I tried it this year. I tried some thriller, and it just not a thriller reader. But that's okay. We all have our different genres, and fantasy, as you can see, is definitely one of my biggest. Also romances those are my two biggest genres. So moving on, 13% of the books I read were rereads, and in fact, not listed, but all of those rereads were actually romance books. That's, I think, the category I reread the most, because if I really enjoy a romance story, I will often pick it up again multiple times because it's just so good. 67% of the books I read were about queer characters. Most of, if not all of those, were also queer authors. So that's pretty good. I do tend to pick up queer stories, and by queer I mean anything across the LGBTQIA plus spectrum. So they were not all just queer romances. Some were just about queer characters who didn't necessarily have a romantic arc, which I also really enjoy, though as you can see from the other statistics, I do quite enjoy romances. And all of my romances, by the way, that I read were also queer, because that's just what I like. And then by author, race, or ethnicity, 71% of the authors I read were authors of color. The biggest chunk of that, you can see, were by Japanese, Chinese, and Korean authors, the East Asian authors. I split them off from the South and Southeast Asian authors because I did have quite a number of those. Otherwise, my whole Asian category would be very big, but my East Asian category is who I read the most of. I did read several prose books by Japanese, Chinese, or Korean authors, but most of that pie chunk is because of those manhwa and manhwa that I read. So the Chinese manhwa and the Korean manhwa, I read a lot. And also some manga, Japanese. I read all of that. So that's where a lot of that chunk comes in. And then I think the final statistic that I tracked was by release year for the book. So as you can see here, my largest chunk is actually the 2020 releases. I didn't have the best reading year in 2020, especially of 2020 releases. I read a lot of older books in 2020, and I didn't read a lot of the books that I ordered in 2020 that were 2020 releases. So I kind of caught up on that this year, and 31% of the books I read were 2020 releases. And then 14% were 2021 releases. So I do still have some 2021 releases to catch up on next year, but I will talk about this in my reading goals. I do hope to read more 2022 releases in 2022 next year. That is one of my goals for next year. So, but as you can see, this is quite a spread. I have books from pretty much every single year, all the way down to like 2009, though I didn't fully list that. So I read a spread, but the largest chunk, like 50%, are from the last couple years, which I think is good. It's, especially as an author, I want to keep up with the stories that are being recently published. So let's move on to my favorite books of the year. We're gonna go through my favorites by category, and in each category I am going to name one book that is my most favorite of that age category. But obviously all 17 of these are favorites. So we will start with middle grade, and I actually only had one favorite middle grade book this year, though as you saw from my reading statistics, I did not read a lot of middle grade, but this is 100% one of my favorite books of the year by far, and so it definitely wins the middle grade category, even though it's the only book in the middle grade category of my favorites, and that is Front Desk by Kelly Yang. This is an amazing middle grade contemporary novel about a girl who immigrates from China with her parents to the US, and they fall upon hardship, and they end up running this hotel in a really terrible situation, and all of the things that this 12-year-old is doing to help her parents and to try to save the hotel, the motel specifically. It's heartbreaking, but also hopeful and beautiful, and just one of those books that you will enjoy if you're a parent. You will enjoy reading to or with your middle grade aged child, because it's just has a lot of layers that both adults can enjoy and kids can enjoy. So highly recommend Front Desk by Kelly Yang. Truly one of my favorite middle grades of all time. And then we will move on. I think I'm gonna jump to the adult category. In adult, I have 8 favorites, 5 of which are manhwa or manhwa. So of those 5, we have a couple contemporary fantasy romances. The first is Whose Baby Is It? And then we also have Prince Bari. Both of these are really fun. Whose Baby Is It is about a young actor who has a baby through this kind of like genetic baby making program, only to learn that the other half of his baby's genetics are from this rich CEO who then like forces him and the baby to live with him. But even though it starts off kind of rocky, the romance that those two develop is beautiful. Their baby is wonderful. All the politics around the acting world and kind of the like rich corporate world are really interesting, and I really enjoy Whose Baby Is It? It's still ongoing. I think I got to chapter like 180, and that's where it had stopped at the point I stopped reading, and at this point we're probably over 200 chapters now, so I should go back and read more and see what happens with the next plot point of Whose Baby Is It? So that's a fun one. And then Prince Bari, that one is complete. This is by Solanine, and this one is about a modern shaman who basically takes clients and helps people through his magic, and he ends up working with a man who doesn't believe in magic, but who is being followed by a spirit. Part of the reason the main character is a shaman is that he has a spirit of his own. So it's the romance between this shaman and this man he's helping, and also the romance between the two spirits who have a mysterious connection to each other. So it's a lot of fun, and like I said, it's complete. So if you enjoy a good contemporary romance, this one is a manhwa. This one's a Korean based contemporary fantasy, and then the other one, Whose Baby Is It, is a Chinese based contemporary. It's got like a little bit of magic, a little bit of sci-fi, but it's really more of a contemporary story. And then we have a couple just fantasies. So we have Daisy, How to Become the Duke's Fiancé. This one is by Alan. This is a story about a young woman who is with an abusive man, and he kills her or she dies. I don't remember if he kills her or if she dies, because like she ran away from him and then she died or something like that, and then she wakes up in the past before she ever got with this man, and so she develops this plan to get engaged to a duke to basically save herself and her family, and she uses her sort of knowledge of the future and also just her innate sense of how to be a good businesswoman to try to set herself up. Oh, and the engagement slash marriage to the duke is a fake marriage or a marriage of convenience. They have a plan. They both need to get married, her to save herself and her family, and him because it's in his grandfather's will that he can't become the duke unless he gets married. So they marry, they get engaged and they marry with a timeline of that they're going to divorce in 3 years after they've set up. So the main character is trying to make sure that she stockpiles enough resources and things so that she can be safe and set up herself for after she divorces, and the Duke starts to fall in love with her and is like, how do I make her stay past 3 years? And it's just a really cute romance. I really love the main character and her business sense. I really love their relationship. It's really sweet and just like a lot of fun. So Daisy, How to Become the Duke's Fiancé, currently only has season 1 out. The way manhwa work is that the chapters come out like a week at a time, and then they'll like end an arc, essentially a book, and that's a season. So there's the first season is out of that one, and you can read all of the first season on TappyToon, I think is where I read that one. So, and then another one is What It Takes to Be a Villainess. I believe is actually a portal fantasy. Yes, it is a portal fantasy. It's about a modern Korean woman who ends up in the body of a fantasy character, and this modern Korean woman was also a businesswoman, and she ends up having to compete with these other women to become the empress or the queen, and the relationship she develops with the prince is just really, really lovely. All of these have really good relationships. I wouldn't favorite it if it didn't. But anyway, she basically in this competition uses her knowledge of like best business practices and economical knowledge in order to win all of these sort of competition pieces of this like competition to become the queen. So it's really cool for that. I love a good competition story, and I love a powerful woman who, you know, knows how to be in charge and like get stuff done, and is very smart about finance and things like that. I read the first 2 seasons of What It Takes to Be a Villainess, and I just really enjoyed both of them. So I will probably dive into season 3 once it is finished releasing. Though I do think the ending of season 2 ends on a very good like stopping point. And then another portal fantasy, and my final manhwa that I read that I favorited of the adult category is I Married the Male Lead's Dad by Eun Ko. This one starts with a really terrible, ridiculous premise. It starts kind of like you don't take it seriously at the beginning. It's about a young woman who's a serious fangirl over this novel, and she's heading to go ask the author of the novel a question, and she gets like hit by a car, and she wakes up in the body of a character from the novel, right? And then it's several years before the novel really starts. The main character of the novel is still a child, so she goes and is like stalking, but not like creepy stalking, just like wants to, you know, see what's going on with the main character as a child, and the main character's dad thinks that she is stalking him and wants to marry him, so they get engaged, and stuff happens. Like it starts out so ridiculous, but it honestly has one of the best plots of any manhwa, especially portal fantasy manhwa, I have ever read. The plot twists in I Married the Male Lead's Dad truly blew me away. The magic system is fascinating. The way the relationships develop, both with the main character and her new fiance, and the main character and her fiance and their son, are just really sweet and really lovely. And I just really loved everything about I Married the Male Lead's Dad. Season 1 ends on a cliffhanger. I am so ready to dive into more of season 2 because it's just such a good story, and I highly recommend it. It came very close to being my top favorite of the adult category, which shows you how much I enjoyed it. But it wasn't quite. So let's talk about the 3 prose novels that I favorited in the adult category. The first of those is Winter's Orbit by Everina Maxwell. This is a science fiction romance, space opera romance about 2 men who are forced into a political marriage, and then there's a murder mystery, and there's this sort of treaty happening that they need to solve before this big galactic empire comes to, you know, sign the treaty and all of this stuff. It's a fun political fantasy romance, and I really enjoyed it. It was another contender for top in the adult category, but not quite. And then next in my favorites is A Deadly Education and the sequel, The Last Graduate by Naomi Novik. I read both of those this year. I enjoyed A Deadly Education more than The Last Graduate, though the ending of The Last Graduate I am ready for the third in the trilogy. It's on my most anticipated list for next year because, I need to know how this trilogy is gonna end. But A Deadly Education is about a girl who goes to a magical school, but this is set in a contemporary fantasy world where monsters are very dangerous and hunt down children with magic. So all of the children with magic go to this magical school, and the magical school is extremely dangerous in and of itself because it's trying to train them to survive against these monsters. And there are also monsters infecting the magical school, and the main character is a very powerful magic user, but she's a loner at the start of the book. She has no friends, she doesn't think she wants friends, and the arc of book 1 is basically about her figuring out that she's wrong about that and about the relationships that she makes with the other people in the school. And it's lovely. It's got a really cool world. I love Naomi Novik's world building personally, though if you're not a world building person, there's a lot of world building in this series, just like a lot of just exposition about the world. So, but I personally loved it. But because of that, it also did not quite make it to my top favorite of the adult category. The final book in my adult favorites, and the one that I would say was my favorite of the adult favorites, was Queen of the Tearling by Erica Johansson. This is a bit of a throwback. I think this book came out in like 2014 or something. The whole trilogy is out. I haven't had a chance to read the next 2 yet, but you can bet I will be reading them in January, probably, or early of 2022. But this is about a young woman who becomes the queen of a nation called the Tearling that is currently under sort of the tyrannical thumb of this big empire, and she has to basically find her agency and her magical powers in order to be able to save her people. It's a very dark, it's like very much on the verge of grimdark. The start of the book is extremely dark, and the whole sort of arc of it, at least in book 1, is about her trying to like drag herself and her people out of that darkness. And I have a lot of feelings about it. So that's the one I'm gonna call my favorite, though as said, the last 4 I talked about are all pretty dang close to being truly adult, like the favorite of the adult favorites of the year. Let's move on to the final category, which is YA, which holds my absolute favorite of the year, like favorite of all categories of the year, and the favorite of the YA of the year, obviously. But we'll start with not my favorite of the year. We'll start with my 2 manhwa. One was Korean and one was Chinese. The Korean manhwa was Who Made Me a Princess. I read seasons 1 and 2. This one is another portal fantasy. It is about a young Korean woman who ends up in the body of a character who is destined to die in this fantasy world. But she ends up in the body of her as a child, and unlike a lot of these portal fantasies, it doesn't age her up quickly at all. In fact, all of season 1, she is a child, essentially, and then season 2, she's a teenager. That's why I put it in the YA category. But the plot and the characters of Who Made Me a Princess are spectacular. It is, next to I Married the Male Lead's Dad, my favorite of the manhwa that I read this year. I really admire a portal fantasy, or this kind of story where you have a character who ends up in the world of a story they know, and yet there continues to be plot twists and things that she misinterpreted, or that now that the actions of the characters are different, completely change the story. And I just really admire that plotting, and I think that combined with the really good characters and the really strong relationships and the really fun world and magic system, all of that combines to make just a really good story. So like What It Takes to Be a Villainess, this one, seasons 1 and 2 are complete, and season 3 is currently coming out. And unlike What It Takes to Be a Villainess, the end of season 2 is a horrible cliffhanger. So you are gonna wanna read through season 3, as I am doing, and I cannot wait for season 3 to finish, and we'll see how long this story ends up being. But oh, it is so good, and it moves through plot points really well. And then next is Augustus Law, which is by Shutibal. This is a manhwa, Chinese graphic novel that is a college-based story, so it's kind of on the edge of YA versus adult, but it's about a young college freshman who ends up going to this magical college, and in this magical college you need to form a pact with one of the sort of demons, one of the supernatural creatures of the college in order to stay safe, because it's quite dangerous for humans to go to this college. And it's, you know, a very cheesy paranormal romance setup, but I really enjoyed especially the beginning of the plot. I've heard that the plot kind of falls apart if you keep going in with the story. I read essentially the first season to the end of the first like major plot arc, and I thought it was amazing, and I didn't really need to or want to read more past that. Like I'm interested. I think I talked about this book in my mid-year book wrap-up, and I think at that point I probably talked about wanting to keep going, but upon some distance, I am very satisfied with the amount that I read, which was to the end of the first major arc, and I am satisfied where it left the main relationship and where they are, and I'm satisfied with the plot twists that we got and all of that. So it is a bit of a problematic story in some ways, but I did find the main relationship, the main character, and the love interest to not be as problematic as other aspects of the world. And it's definitely got a tinge of horror, like a big tinge of horror to it, but I did personally really enjoy at least the beginning of Augus's Law. My final graphic novel that I favorited was Spinning by Tillie Walden. This is a graphic novel memoir about a figure skater who actually grew up. Quite a number of her childhood and teenage years were in Austin, which is where I live, and in fact the places where she practices for figure skating and for synchronized skating are places that I actually took figure skating lessons on and ice skating lessons on as a child, so it was like very nostalgic, and that's I think partially why this book became a favorite. But I just found it to be a really beautiful portrayal of the beginning of Tillie Walden's life and sort of the struggles and the less glamorous side of the figure skating world. It was very raw and honest, and the art I think really aided in telling this story, so I was very impressed. And if you are at all interested in figure skating and the figure skating world, I would recommend Spinning. And then the next two books are actually the two ones that I listened to via audiobook that I favorited. Both are contemporary YA romances. The first is Her Royal Highness by Rachel Hawkins. Loved it. It's about a girl from Texas who goes for her senior year to a boarding school in Scotland and ends up rooming with the Scottish princess, and all of the sort of like enemies to lovers shenanigans that happen because of that. So enjoyed Her Royal Highness, and then I really enjoyed Hanny and Issue's Guide to Fake Dating by Adiba Jagadar. This is about two Bengali girls living in Ireland who fake date, one of them to become a head girl and the other one to prove to her friends that she is bisexual. It talks about their Bengali culture and also the differences between their two sort of family cultural lines. One is Muslim, one is not, and all sorts of the sort of aspects of the family and their family sort of expectations that come into both lines, which I think was really fascinating. I don't know a lot about Bengali culture, so I learned a lot reading this book, but also just had a fun time. I loved Honey and Issue's relationship. I loved them together. They're one of those things, like sometimes you read a couple and you're like, oh, that's fun, but you don't really know, especially in YA, you don't necessarily expect them to last. But Honey and Issue, I could totally imagine just like growing old together. They're lovely, and the fake dating turning into real feelings thing was just a lot of fun. So I really enjoyed Honey and Issue's Guide to Fake Dating. And then we have Blood Like Magic by AuthorTube's own Lizelle Sambury. This is a near future story, but also an urban fantasy about a witch living in Toronto who, in order to save her family's magic, must destroy her first love. And then she signs up for this genetic matchmaking program, and just stuff happens. This book is quite dark. Like, it's darker than I expected it to be, and it does not end in a nice, pretty bow, though it is a duology, so I'm very much looking forward for the second book coming out next year in 2022, summer 2022. but I really enjoyed it. It's a big, chunky novel, but I flew through it. I found all of the various aspects of the familial relationships and the budding romance with the boy who she's destined to kill. Also the various aspects of the witch society in Toronto and the sort of discussions of slavery and racism and all of that coming in as well. Just all work together really, really well. And I hesitate to call it fun, even though I definitely did have fun at various points, but it also just like made my heart pound for most of the book, and I just like was racing through it because I just couldn't stop, and it was really well done. So definitely recommend Blood Like Magic if you're interested in dark fantasy. And then we have another dark fantasy. This one's more of a historical dark fantasy. I think it's set in the turn of the 20th century. This is Keeper of the Night by Kylie Lee Baker, my agent sibling. Gosh, Kylie is brilliant and her writing, I adored it. I loved the world building. This is about a young half British Grim Reaper, half Japanese Soul Reaper girl who has to flee from London from the British Grim Reaper Society to Japan, and ends up being tasked by the goddess of death to kill these yokai, these Japanese demons that are supposed to be very difficult to kill. She and her brother go to Japan and get this quest, and they're also aided by an outcast Japanese Shinigami, and they work together, and it's just action after action after action. There is no slow point in this novel at all. The only thing you could maybe consider slow, but which I found to be just a perk, is that before each of these sections where they have to kill one of the yokai, they read the original sort of myth of that specific yokai. So you get a little bit of the original Japanese folklore of the yokai, and then you get to see it in Kylie's world and this fantasy novel. So it's really good. If you like Japanese mythology, I think you'll really enjoy it. It also talks about racism, and specifically the racism of being biracial, the racism that comes with being biracial, which is a very different brand of racism. It sounds horrible, but hopefully you get what I mean. And I think that it's just all so brilliantly done. I just really, really love Keeper of the Night. It's another one that ends on a horrible cliffhanger, and I cannot wait for book 2 of the duology to come out next year, but it's worth it. Of YA and also all of the books, I have talked about this before. I posted about it on Instagram, so this might not be a surprise, but my favorite book of the year, 100%, was Legendborn by Tracy Deonn. I loved this book. This is a contemporary fantasy about a girl who goes to college for this kind of like high school dual credit college program to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which already makes me excited because I was actually born in Chapel Hill. I spent quite a lot of my childhood visiting my grandparents in Chapel Hill, so I was like, but I like this book for way more reasons than that. I loved the main character. I loved her fire. I loved her dealing with grief. This book is about a girl who loses her mom and has to fight with her grief for the majority of the novel, but also just the fun fantasy aspect of it. She ends up getting embroiled in this secret society at the university that's made up of descendants of King Arthur and his knights, and they do magic, and there are demons that they are fighting, and she ends up entering this trial to become the squire of one of these descendants. I loved that despite the fact that our main character was the only black girl and one of the only characters of color in this secret society, the book still managed to bring in other characters of color and black characters to be a support system for her, which I really, really loved the way Tracy Deonn did that. I just adored the plot twists. I adored the relationships. I even kind of liked the love triangle, which I normally don't, but it's a very unique love triangle in the sense that like I don't even honestly have an opinion on like which boy she should get with. I think they're both great in different ways, and honestly I just want all three of them to end up together, so fingers crossed. We'll see what happens. I'm gonna spoil it if I talk about it more, but if you have not read Legendborn yet, I feel like I was one of the last people on earth who hadn't, but you should. If you are at all interested in contemporary fantasy, and if you enjoy King Arthur myth and sort of like twists on Arthurian legend, read Legend Board. I think I talked for long enough. Thank y'all for listening. Anyway, check out my description for causes that need your support. I always have links in my description for these causes that you should consider donating to or helping in some way you can. And I look forward to chatting with y'all in the comments.